Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. This is Science Professor Obene. Welcome to the channel. If you haven't already subscribed, you need to be a believer and subscribe. Alright, so today we're in the science classroom. We are looking at biodiversity or species diversity. Alright, so today we are going to look at biodiversity or species diversity or genetic variety. They are the same. Biodiversity, species diversity, genetic variety, they are the same. Okay? We are going to look at that and how that impacts the ecosystem. Okay? So this is Science Professor Obene. Alright, so when we talk about biodiversity, biodiversity simply means the number of species and its abundance or the abundance of each species that live in a particular location. Diversity simply means variety, different forms of the same organism. That's biodiversity. So biodiversity simply means the number of the species and also the abundance of each species in a particular location or environment. So if you take a look at your screen, you see organisms, you see species of dogs. You see different varieties or different kinds of dogs. Okay? So that is biodiversity. Biodiversity is very, very important to the ecosystem. So today we are going to learn how biodiversity is important to the ecosystem. All right, so the importance of biodiversity or species diversity or genetic variety, they include biodiversity increases the stability of the ecosystem. It makes the ecosystem more stable, more reliable. Okay? Biodiversity of species also increases the chances that at least some will survive in the face of large environmental changes. When there is a drought or environmental change, biodiversity will ensure that some of the species will survive because of genetic variety. Because some species are different, they have different genetic components. So biodiversity is very, very important to the ecosystem. And finally, one other importance of biodiversity is that biodiversity also ensures the availability of a rich variety of genetic material. So when you have a lot of genetic material in the ecosystem, when you have a large variety of genetic material in the ecosystem, that will lead to future agricultural or medicinal discoveries with significant value to humankind. Because of different varieties of organisms or species in the ecosystem, that can lead to future agricultural or medicinal discoveries. So these are very, very important to the ecosystem. So biodiversity is essential. And remember, biodiversity, species diversity, or genetic variety, they are the same. Okay? And that means that when we talk about bio means life. Okay? And diversity means different forms of life. Okay? So species diversity and biodiversity, they are the same. That means that in that environment, you have different genetic variety, different forms of the same organisms or different organisms in the ecosystem. So biodiversity is essential to the ecosystem. Okay? So when you remove organisms from an environment, when you remove the removal of predator populations from an ecosystem would result in a decrease in ecosystem diversity because we are removing a group of organisms from the ecosystem. And whenever you remove a group of organisms from the ecosystem, that will reduce the ecosystem diversity. All right, remember, the higher or the richer the ecosystem diversity, the more stable the ecosystem is. So when you remove one kind of organism or one kind of population from the ecosystem, that will reduce the ecosystem diversity. So here we are looking at diversity and ecosystem, biodiversity and ecosystem ecological succession or ecosystem diversity. All right, so the graph we see here, this graph represents ecological succession graph. This is ecological succession graph. With time, you see different populations of organisms. So it started with grass stage, shrub, pine forest, then we went to hardwood forest. Okay, so this is with time. With time, different populations or communities are being replaced on the same environment. All right, so we already know that biodiversity is the number and species and the number and also the abundance of each species that live in a particular environment. Okay, so let's look at the impact of biodiversity in an environment. All right, so the question reads, what is the effect of the removal of the predator population from an ecosystem on ecosystem diversity? If you remove lions from an ecosystem, how would that affect or impact the ecosystem diversity? And we already know that if you remove one group of organisms, it will decrease the ecosystem diversity. And that's not good for ecosystem stability. All right? So the removal of one group of organisms or population from an ecosystem will decrease the ecosystem diversity. All right? So let's move on. So here we are looking at what is a short-term effect that a forest fire during stage D will have on the biodiversity of the area. So we have stage D. Stage D, what do we have? We have the hardwood forest, stage D. Okay? So when we have a short term, we are looking at the short-term effect or impact. Supposing there is a forest fire at stage D. And whenever there is a forest fire, remember, some organisms will be killed. Plants and animal life or species may be lost. So when that happens, that will decrease the biodiversity. The biodiversity will decrease, or many trees and animals will no longer be present in the area. So the short-term effect is that it will decrease the biodiversity of the area. Okay, so now let's look at invasive species and its impact on ecosystem. Sometimes some organism may be introduced into a community or an ecosystem. Some living organism may be introduced, all right? And whenever some, new organisms are introduced to ecosystems, they sometimes are beneficial or harmful, to other populations in that environment. All right, so when we talk about invasive species, an invasive species is an organism that causes ecological or economic harm in a new environment where it is not native. Native means it's not originally from that environment. So we are introducing that organism into the environment. All right, and they may have positive or negative impact on other population or on the ecosystem as a whole. All right, so in our diagram here we see brown tree snake. This organism is an invasive species. So the introduction of this organism into a new environment may cause harm. This organism may eat other organisms. All right, and this will result in the extinction of other organisms. Okay. So an invasive species can be any kind of living organism. For example, amphibian like the cane toad, plants, insects, fungus, bacteria, or even an organism's seed, all right, which is not native to the ecosystem and it can cause harm to the ecosystem. Okay, so that's an invasive species. They can cause harm to the ecosystem. All right, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of introducing an invasive species or organism into a new ecosystem? All right, so the advantages or the pros of introduction of organism into a new environment include the new organism which has been introduced to the environment, or we can introduce an organism to an environment, to an area, for example, to eliminate or reduce the population of pests. Pests infect, plants, for example, All right. So whenever you have, natural enemy of that, pest, you can introduce that natural enemy into the environment in order to, kill or eliminate, the natural, the pest population. So that's an advantage. All right. A disadvantage would be that the invasive species or the species you've introduced into the environment can cause disruption of food chains and food webs. They can disrupt the food chains and food web. How energy flows through the ecosystem, they can, disrupt, the link. Also, the invasive species, they can feed on other organisms to reduce their population to the extent that the populations or the species, other species may even go extinct because of the invasive species, because of the organism that has been introduced. All right? So here we are looking at the Galapagos Island. All right? So what will be the effect of introduction of organisms such as goats? All right, we have goats. On the Galapagos Island, we have turtles. Okay? So turtles, they are herbivores. They eat plants. So what will be the effect of introduction of organisms such as goats on the Galapagos Island? And when you introduce goats to the Galapagos Island, what will happen is that the goats, because they are also herbivores, they are going to compete. So that will increase competition for food source for the turtles. And that may eventually reduce the population of the turtles. Okay? So here we are looking at the role or selecting the environment acting as selecting agent. Okay? So when we say an environment is acting as a selecting agent, that simply means that it's the role the environment plays in determining which species survive in that area. The environment can determine which species will survive in that area. For example, the acidity of the soil, the amount of rainfall of the soil, the nutrients in the soil, all these can contribute to the organism that will live, or the producers, for example, that will live or survive in that area. And we know how energy flows through ecosystems too. So the kind of producers you have in the environment will also determine the herbivores that will live in the environment. All right? The herbivores may also determine the kind of predators or carnivores that will live in that area. So here we are looking at the environment acting as selecting agent. Selecting means it's choosing. Okay? The environment is playing the role of choosing or determining which species survive in an area. And this is known as selecting agent. Okay? So this role of the environment, we call it selecting agent. Okay? So let's do a quick recap. All right, so we started with biodiversity. Biodiversity simply means the number of species and the abundance of each species that live in a particular area. We have the importance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is very important to the ecosystem because biodiversity increases the stability of the ecosystem. That's the first point. Biodiversity increases the stability of the ecosystem. The more variety of organisms you have in the ecosystem, the more stable the ecosystem is. Diversity of species also increases the chances that at least some of the organisms will survive when there is a large environmental change or environmental changes. Finally, biodiversity also ensures that the availability of rich variety of genetic material that may lead to future agricultural or medicinal discoveries with significant value to mankind. So that means if you have large variety of organisms or species in an area, you can benefit from getting material that may lead to future agricultural or medicinal discoveries. You can, because you have large variety of genetic material. Okay, so these are the importance of biodiversity. And always we should remember that when we add organisms to the ecosystem, that means we are increasing